All right, so web services. We already have a, Spring Boot application that we started working at the beginning of the semester. We're going to keep using that same application. We first used it to host our jQuery assignment, and we showed you how jQuery applications can running on the browser can communicate with a server, right? Now, the service that they were communicating was my server, right, that I was hosting in Heroku and whatnot. And we would like to learn today, well, how is it that we can create our own services, right? How is it that we can have our client application talk to the server? So here's we're going to be using the Spring Boot framework to create our server and host our web services. You should already have this. And we're going to be using the one that we started a while back. We'll bring it back to life here, and then it'll listen at port 8080. In there, I believe one of the early assignments was for you to try out and set up an environment, right, that was running a Spring Boot application. So we're going to go back to that and start using it for hosting our web services. I believe in the assignment you were asked to implement some toy services to make sure that you can communicate with them. Here's just a couple examples on how you would do that by using the REST controller annotation. Here we decorated this class as a REST controller. What this does is that it puts this class, makes it available in a web environment, right? So that we can hit it with an HTTP URL. In there, you can send HTTP GET requests as follows, right? Where you can use HTTP either from a browser or some HTTP applications such as Postman. And so here's a couple of things that I wanted to go over. These URLs usually have a specific syntax, right, that we need to become familiar with, right? So first of all, the HTTP usually is the protocol that we're using, and yes, we are using HTTP. Then it follows usually the name of the machine or the domain name. Here, I took out the domain name, and then it follows the path. So this path, usually this path, you think about it, the default thinking of a path typically is that it maps to some physical file on some physical hard drive, right? But we have since understood that the path can be much more than that, right? It could be some virtual path, perhaps mapped to some logical location or some logical state of your application, right? If you say /courses or /course details or /course editor or whatever, right? That typically is being interpreted by the application to render one content versus another. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to display a particular physical file. Yes, and so we're going to take that idea that this is a virtual path, right? That it's not really mapped to some physical file. We're going to take that idea even beyond, right? We're going to go even beyond that. Usually, these paths. The way we think about it in a web application is mapped to some page or some user interface that you want to display. Yes? Well, we're going to go beyond that and say, well, it not necessarily does it map to anything that is even visual, right? It could map to maybe some access, some data access, right? Some data that is being provided by the server. So we're going to think about this in a more general sense that these paths map to a resource. Whether that resource is a user interface or that resource is a data resource, right? We can decide what it maps to. Make sense? Right. Also, these URLs, we're going to be interested in being able to choose a name that describes the resource in some way, and so we're going to try and stick to nouns, right? That describe the resources. So usually those paths will be some combination of nouns, right? Of the various resources that are involved. Maybe it could be courses or widgets or lessons. Yes, so it'll be some plural noun that references some set of resources. Yes. Also, typically, the very last part of the path will typically be have some either it'll be just a noun, or it'll have some primary key that references a particular instance of that resource. So you might be able to reference a particular lesson as opposed to a set of lessons. Yes? And that primary key, that ID here, will typically be some unique identifier for a particular resource. Then follows the query that follows the question mark here. And this is going to be a set of name value pairs that are delimited by the ampersand sign, right? And these we're going to refer to this as the query string, and this query string is going to allow us to provide any set of unbounded predicates, right? Where we can say, well, we might want to filter the results here based on some predicate. So, for instance, we might say, give me a list of all the employees, but then I want to filter out, well, the ones that are making at least $10,000, right? So we can specify the predicates on the right-hand side of the query string. Make sense? All right. So we're going to be interested in using this path not only for accessing user interfaces, like we've been doing so far, using routers, using React router DOM, yes, but we're also going to be interested in using these URLs for accessing data from a server, yes, and the server is going to have to be able to distinguish and understand, well, which one do you want? Do you want a user interface, or do you want data, right? Do you want some JSON data? And typically, the way we're going to distinguish between the two is that we're going to prepend, right? We're going to prepend the URL with some token that we can all agree on. We can say maybe we'll use the keyword data, or the keyword REST, or the keyword API, or something, right, that distinguishes this from either UI or data. Make sense? All right. So here's a simple example where we have declared our class as a REST controller, and it's also, we have declared a function here that says hello, say hello. And basically what it does is that what we're doing here is that we would like to be able to, from outside of the application, invoke this function, right? So that if you have a communication between two processes, each one can perhaps invoke each other's functions, right, and run some logic, some algorithm. And the way we do this is by exposing the network point using the get mapping attribute here, the annotation. We're saying that this function will execute if the URL that comes in has the pattern that it starts with a slash, right, and ends with a hello. Okay, and if the server sees that pattern, the URL pattern, it will execute this function, right? In this particular function, what it's doing is just responding with a literal string says hello world, right? And that's fine. That's exactly what the URL is going to respond with. So if you hit localhost 8080, hello, it'll come back with hello world. Or you can also parameterize your URLs so that you can pass data across as parameters to a function that is running remotely using the path variable. You can declare, using the curly brackets, you can declare placeholders, right? That allows you to put anything in there. Numbers, strings, dates. You can put anything there, and then you can read it and parse it from the URL using the annotation path variable. Path variable can refer to the placeholder, give it a name, and then whatever value was in there, it will be parsed and then passed to you in the signature of the function. Right? Very useful. And then again, you can use it, however you use it, it's up to you, right? However you want to use that. So here, for instance, we're passing Alice, and the server responds with hello, Alice. Also, not only can we pass parameters as part of the path. Maybe here this ID could be a path parameter. We can also pass values or parameters in the query string. So we need to be able to parse the path, and we need to be able to parse the query. Usually this query is referred to as the request query, and we can parse it using the request parameter. So request parameter annotation allows you to refer to a particular name value pair and then parse the value and then pass it to you as a parameter to the function. So here, for instance, we're passing a message equal life is good. We are reading that message and then display, use it to concatenate a response to the client. Finally, we can pass a complex data types, right? Instead of just passing these primitive data types of strings, integers, doubles. Obviously, those you can pass those around. You can also pass complex data types, right? So here's a simple message class that is a compound, complex data type that has one text, one string, and one date, right? And here we have an example of a function that is responding with an instance of a message, right? And that message has a default text and it has today's date. Okay, so notice that what's happening here is that this message is being is the instance that is being instantiated here is being sent back as a response to the client, whoever hit this. Now, if this were maybe a decade or so ago, this Java instance would have been converted into some XML representation of the data, right? Since then, more recently, JSON has become the preferred way of sending and receiving data across HTTP networks, right? So today you would see that this message would have been converted into some JSON representation of this object, right? There would be a text. It would look something like this. This is what you would get: text, default text, and then created at, and then the date of today's date. Okay. Right. So not only do we want to read data from the client as we've been doing, we would also want to be able to send data to the server, right? And the way we're going to do that is usually through using HTTP POST. Okay. So POST is going to allow us to send data from the client over to the server. Right? So here's an example of an object that we might want to send over from the client over to the server, and username and password. And here's an example of using the request body, right, to parse the incoming data that is coming from the client, presumably formatted as a JSON string, and the request body is going to parse that JSON request string that's coming from the client, is going to try and convert it into a user instance, right? So we'll instantiate a user instance, and it will map the user and password attributes that in the JSON object that is incoming in the body. It'll try to map it to the username and password in the Java world. Okay, and here we're using a POST to do that. All right, let's talk about REST.